in the past 15 years, actually, non-governmental organization or the civil society is my main research topic. And when I think of the Chinese NGOs, I always compare it with a growing naughty boy child with growing pains, with growing pains. You know, when you are a child or when you are a middle school student and or the university students, maybe your parents, your friends, and your teachers always ask, what will you do in the future, and who will you be in the future? And sometimes you will ask yourself this kind of questions. So as for the Chinese NGOs, I think it has the same problem. We are always ask will the Chinese non-governmental organizations or this kind of organizations will be a kind of civil society or a kind of corporatism. But actually this sector is quite rapidly changing and always, and maybe sometimes with fluctuations. And also this sector is also more and more diversified with some contradictions. So it's hard to say who it will be in the future for both scholars and also for the policy makers and practitioners. So this is very interesting sector, and this interesting sector, this changing sector, dynamic sector, make a very dynamic research field in China studies, I think, in the past decades. As this dynamic research field is also ever-changing. Maybe basically the most important change is, I think, is the change of methodology. In my paper, the first part, I summarized this I try to summarize this kind of change. I say that it's maybe this research field is change from the theory-driven field and to the data-driven field, because you know in 1990s we began to explore this sector because of the introduction of this kind of concepts and theories. For example, the civil society, corporatism, all of us are talking about these concepts. And also public service concern, just as Carla mentioned, and Jessica Tis and will discuss the because China is always saying we are trying to build a small government, a big society. So this kind of society should need a kind of partnership between the state and the society. But what is the society? And so this is also very interesting theory drive this field development. But this kind of theory-driven research actually have some problems, especially when the theories meet the data, because empirically we should find, is there any real or truly independent sectors or truly civil society actors? So at the beginning we find that they have no data, no overall map. We know little about the overall map, and so we began to do case studies. We try to find some case studies which will represent a development of civil society or will illustrate that there might be some kind of corporatist model. But mostly in 1990s, all these, almost all the case studies get a quite pessimistic conclusion. They will say they were very tiny sector of real NGOs with a strong state control. So they even introduced many very interesting creative concepts embryonic or nascent civil society, and semi-civil society, and state-led civil society, and so on. So this is a kind of theory-driven research in my conception. But you know, this is very interesting because the case study is highly selective and highly and it's hard to map the whole landscape. But with help this more and more case studies, and with the development of this sector and the time, more and more data came out, and more and more case study came out. I think that maybe in the past decade, we have a very basic change is in methodology. Is I call it the data-driven research. With data-driven research, when I read the papers by most of our participants, I think all of us are data-driven research. We try to we are highly skeptical about the concept of civil society, corporatism, and other we call it the westernized concepts or theories. So we try to go to the field and find what's the disparity between the theory and the data, and mostly we try to propose some new concepts and new theory to explain the current situation of China. And other scholars also join this effort, this kind of effort. They, for example, the former presenter mentioned Kang Xiaoguang. Kang Xiaoguang and Han has a very influential paper. He introduced the gratuity control, the 分类控制 to explain the resilience of the authoritarian state just like China. And actually, in their paper, they put all kinds of organizations together. Some are gangers, some are grassroots, and try to find why there are differences between the state and the different kind of serious kind of organizations. So this is a kind of data-driven research, I think, and this maybe it's interesting for us to discussing where this sector will go, because when we introduce a quite inclusive definition of NGOs, actually, Dr. Xie has illustrated a very broad picture in his very interesting paper, and this is a smaller landscape. I didn't include in the 事业单位 and other government-owned social service organizations here, only including the registered and the registration exemptions, and also the recorded associations or unregistered associations. But this map is quite complex now and very diversified. So this during my PhD period, I have a very simple idea, because I try to find maybe some of these kind of organizations are mostly like the civil society model, and some of them like the corporatism model in at different levels and in different places. But what is the whole picture? What is the whole picture? So I try to have some quantitative data connection to map out this kind of the landscape of this sector, and try to understand proportions of each part, and also what role of each part, each part will play in the whole sector. So with more quantitative analysis, maybe we can have more detailed analysis. So this is my formal research. I try to describe this diversified sector. And you may find that I always use sector, the word sector. I didn't treat or regard the NGOs as individual organizations. I try to put all kinds of these organizations together, and they act as an actor, as a sector. A sector interact with the government. Jennifer tried to disintegrate the state actors and the NGOs actors, but I try to put them together as a sector. Why I do that? Because maybe if you have some, if you go into the policy process, you will find that regulating policies always comes from the interaction between the government and the inclusive sector. They interact with the grassroots, they interact with gangs, and they interact with the mass organizations, and even the government will think that the mass organizations is a very important part of the associational life of the Chinese people. So this is the reality. The state makes the policy based on a sector, not based on a sector of a part of this sector. And with the national policy change, they will always balance between the ideal model and the reality, the balance between the registered and the unregistered, and also the balance between the gangs and the grassroots. When we do field studies, we always find that maybe as for the removal of the dual management system, the MPs didn't actually comes partly maybe mainly from the gangs, because this the removal of dual management system will disconnect the gangs and the supervisor agencies, and they will lose the resources of the resources. So this will be a balance between different kind of organizations and different parts. And also in past several years, there were some very, very interesting social innovation. We call social innovation, social management innovation, innovation of traditional thinking. For example, as just mentioned, the mass organizations. As in the party state will think that mass organizations is a transport between the state, between the party, the state, and the mass publics. So they try to introduce the mass organizations as a new kind of harbor organizations. We call it the 枢纽型组织 to reconstruct this whole kind of systems. So maybe mass organizations is also important and will play a more and more important role in the coming years in the associational life of the Chinese people. So this is the rationale and the reasons. So when we put all kinds of organizations together, then we will find, firstly, it is diversified, but secondly, it's a very controversial sector with many contradictions. I summarized maybe most importantly 4 contradictions: independent versus dependent, and non-profit versus for-profit, and formal versus informal, modern versus traditional. And I think that maybe each dimension of this kind of contradictions have impacts on the regulations of NGOs or the change in regulations on NGOs. Because of time, I will only focus on some of 2 of the dimensions. The first is individual and independent and dependent. Ideally, we think that the civil society organizations or the NGO non-government organizations should be independent from the state. But the reality is that actually they have some independent organizations, maybe one or more independent organizations, but there are many and even much more independent organizations. And also they have an intervening institutional framework, just like the dual management and we call it the non-competition principle. So this is the reality. They have a gap between the ideal and the ideal model and the reality. So the researchers try to explain the reality, the realities we will use in the Chinese is the 光明二重性, and in English, for example, the institutional effortlessness, and Carlin Xu and other, for example, Kenneth First introduced the organizational theory, very interesting organizational theory to explain these realities. But this very interesting structure is also is not static. Is also ever changing because the development, rapid development, and because the changing marketization, and so they have this balance or this structure is also ever changing, and mainly in the process of pursuit of autonomy. For example, I've mentioned the rapid growth, growing of the grassroots NGOs. Many of them are quite independent and autonomous. And also they have some change of gangrels. Some of the gangrels became more and more independent or became more and more autonomous. And Dr. Louis Yi also introduced the distinction between the independent and the autonomy. I said that maybe some organizations seems like structural dependence, but actually function quite autonomously. And also very interesting, in the past 2 decades, it's a very important government initiative to try to make the boundary between the state and the society more clear. They have several files to issue for a prohibition of the incumbent official to assume the leadership of NGOs. And very interesting, we do a survey nationwide in 2003, just after the house cleaning campaign ended in 2001. We found that actually, even after such a tight house cleaning campaign, the independence or the autonomy of the registered NGOs increased statistically. So this is a very interesting dynamic change, is ever changing. And we're introducing some dynamic of the governance or the regulations, because the dual management is a very always being criticized for the highly impede to the registration, because they have very strong administrative linkers between the state and the NGOs. So it mixes the political control and the administrative independence. But in the past 2 decades, the government initiative of the autonomy tried to dislink the administrative linkage between the state and the gangrels. So they have tried some new forms in Patricia Thornton's new article in China Quarterly this year. He said that the state retreats, but the party appears. So this is kind of a new form of this. The regulations changed with the change structure or change in situation. So this is kind of dimensions. Other dimensions is also the same. For example, we're always saying the non-government should be non-profit, but maybe half of the non-government organizations in China is for-profit. Some gangrels are for-profit, and some the private social service provider, the non-enterprise unit, most of them are actually for-profit, especially the private schools and the private hospitals. So this has also very interesting, also introduced a very interesting administrative dimension for us to understanding the dynamic of the regulation policy. The state try to build the capacity of the tax, for example, the certification of the tax-free status and other with other the change of the ideology or the conceptions of the ownership. So, okay, sorry. Okay, and as for other two dimensions, is also I illustrate them. I write in my paper to try to explore their impacts in the dynamic change of the regulatory framework of China. I think maybe it's important for us to introduce some administrative dimensions to understanding this very interesting sector, and maybe after this kind of research, the data-driven research, we will be more confident where we will go and who we will be. So thank you much.